This video we're going to show how to make some artificial flowers. This one we're just going to show the lily. Is the A to Z of machine knitting. Very good book, filled with lots of information. So we're going to show you the process for each of these, showing both the original method where I used fully fashioned increases and decreases, and then I can quickly go over the eyelets option, which is faster for increasing if you need to make these more quickly. Personally, I prefer the fully fashioned look. It looks more realistic. So over at the machine, before we start, I'm going to reset the row counter. Make sure my carriage is set to plain knitting. Increase the tension dial up to 10. Now the method I'm going to use for casting on is a cast on rag. You can use any preferred cast on method if you wish. So following the pattern, we have our 4-ply yarn threaded in the machine, and we want to cast on 12 stitches. So I'm going to pull forward 12 stitches, so that's 6 on either side of 0. I'm going to take my latch tool opening card. This is just an old credit card with a cut made in it, and I'm going to open all of my latches so that they don't catch on the cast on rag as I feed it in. And we're going to feed these holes or eyelets in one end of the rag onto each needle. One hole, one needle should come through. Very quick and easy. This allows you to instantly add weight to the work, which is particularly great if you're doing small items. We're then ready to come in with our ravel cord. My ravel cord is on a handy storage bobbin. I have it marked with how many needles this cord length will cover, so that I don't end up on larger projects grabbing a short cord. So I've put a peg on the end of the cord. I'm just going to thread my carriage. My tension dial was already set for 10. I'm going to disengage my row counter for this row and knit across. Unthread the carriage and just drop that bobbin down and let it hang. So I'm now going to adjust my tension back to a main tension. I'm going to set mine for 5 for this yarn that I'm using. I'm going to pull out all of the needles, and I'm going to cast on with the E-wrap method. So I have the peg on the end. I'm going to come in between needle 1 and 2 and counterclockwise wrap this needle. Ensure that the loop you create isn't too tight, otherwise you could cause the carriage to jam or the yarn will break as you try to knit across. And we're just counterclockwise wrapping each needle. Little tip, to save you fighting the take up spring, you may wish to pull out some slack first. You can thread the carriage, close the feeder gate, and we're ready to follow the pattern, and we're going to knit 6 rows. Now I'll admit the samples here that I've made to create the 6 rows, if I was to add these onto a garment by themselves, I find the 6 rows is too much height there if we were to only applique a few on. So for this example, I'm just going to do 2 rows. So now we're going to increase 1 stitch at the opposite end of the carriage every row until there are 26 stitches on the needles. So we're going from 12 stitches and we'll gradually increase up to 26. Now remember to re-engage your row counter at this point if you haven't already done so. So the quickest way to do the increase, which will give you the eyelets, is to take your single prong tool, take the end needle and move the stitch over by 1. If you'd rather do the fully fashioned increase, then we're going to take the 2-prong tool and take the end 2 needles, again opposite the carriage, move those over by 1, and you can decide whether or not at this point you want to pull the needles all the way out. If you're more of a beginner, I'd recommend that you do that. Then we have an empty needle, which would give us an eyelet, but since we're doing fully fashioned, we're going to lift the heel of the stitch from the row below. So coming in with the transfer tool on its side, go to the stitch below, you'll see a little purl bump. You want to place the transfer tool into the hole below, and sometimes I find, especially working at tight tension and splitty yarn, to pull the needle back so that we can catch that single strand. And then we're going to fill the empty needle with that stitch. Knit across and repeat for the other side. and continue on up to the point where there are 26 needles in work. Just be careful you don't get too carried away like I just did and end up trying to increase both sides. I'm still in garment making mode, clearly. So now we have the 26 stitches we've worked up to. We're going to knit 2 plain rows, and then we're ready to do the decreasing. So if you want to do again the eyelets in the decreasing section, you'll need to use your 7-prong tool in that setup, and you'll go on the edge, needle with the edge prong, take those 2 stitches off, move them over, push the first empty needle out of work and keep the second empty needle in work, and that's what creates the eyelet. And you would do that on both sides. I'm going to do the fully fashioned decrease. I find this a lot quicker. So our decreasing, we're going to do 1 stitch, both ends, every alternate row. So we're going to decrease, knit, knit, decrease, knit, knit, all the way down until we have 1 stitch left. So my fully fashioned decrease, I've got my 2-prong tool, taking the end needles, transferring them in, make sure that empty needle goes out of work. Do this on both sides. Ensure the empty needle goes out of work. Now at this point you may want to move your weight up to one side and take another weight to hang on this other edge. 2 rows, decrease. Now as we get down to the end, we can see now if we were to do the 2-prong for transferring, we'd end up overlapping stitches. So we're just going to take the single prong tool, transfer each end stitch over, make sure the empty needles are back out of work. And what I'm going to do this time, instead of knitting 2 rows, I'm going to knit 1 and then transfer for 1 single stitch, and we can now cast off. Quite simple, 1 stitch left for cast off. So let's unthread the carriage. You can see it's already wanting to drop away from the machine. So we can take the weights off of this. Pull it up. What we're going to do is cut the yarn pull the loop all the way through and set this to the side. You can at this point, if you want, remove the cast on rag and ravel cord. So I've taken the peg off of the end and I'm just going to pull the ravel cord from the bobbin side through so that the piece lifts away from the cast on rag, and we can use the cast on rag for the next part. Now we're ready for the second step, which is the centre stamen area. So I've got a different yarn threaded into the machine now. We want to pull forward 4 needles. We're going to knit on a slightly tighter tension than the flower. So I was at tension 5 before, I'm going to go down to a tension 4. Again, the same method, use the cast on rag and the ravel cord. So make sure all of your latches are open. Placing on the cast on rag. Hanging a weight. Peg on the end of the ravel cord. Threaded into the machine. Now the ravel cord we want to do at a tension 10. This makes it easier for us to pull out afterwards. Now we're ready to start, but the way I've done the cast on rag and ravel cord means that my carriage is now on the left hand side. I need the carriage to be on the right hand side so that when I E-wrap, the yarn can go into the feeder for the carriage. So with your needles in B position, brother users can push in the part button which means moving from left to right, we will slip. So that's needles in B position, right part button will slip the needles, meaning they won't work. For Knitmaster, you have a button on the top of your carriage. Sometimes the plastic is a red colour button that you will have to pull sideways, and there'll be a little arrow to either side of the button. That will release your carriage up, and that is your free pass mechanism. If you're not comfortable or sure about that setting, then you can always pull the needles all the way forward to hold position, which for brother is position E, for Knitmaster position D. You're just pulling the needles all the way forward on the bed. Brother users, you would then slip your mechanism here on the left hand side of the carriage to H. You would cancel all of this would be cancelled. You would just slip this to H with the needles all the way out. And Knitmaster users, you would have to select your right front rustle lever from 2 to 1. But using the part or the free pass mechanism just means less work moving needles and things. So free pass, there we go. Now we're ready to cast on. We just do the same again. Pull the needles all the way out. Pull some slack through the take-up spring so that we're not fighting it, and do an E-wrap cast on. So, as always, to keep the tails away from the sinker plate or getting caught up, we're just going to put a peg on the tail and then E-wrap. 4 needles. So with E-wrap, we're going to feed the carriage. Our row counter is set back to 0. We're going to change down to our preferred tension and knit 1 row. Ensure that the carriage is reset. Now we're ready to set up for the I cord, which means we want to slip going in one direction and knit going the other. Brother, this is quite simple. We just push in one of the part buttons. Knitmaster, you're going to take your cam dial, place it to S, and you're going to select the side lever on one side and take it from the triangle to the dot. And we're going to knit a further 24 rows. When we're done, we can cast off. My preferred way to cast off for an I cord is to use a darning tool. So I'm just going to cut this yarn. You only need to leave a 3 to 4 inch tail. I'm going to thread the darning needle the tail's coming to the left. I'm going to go in to the right. And thread the needle through these live stitches as if you were placing in a lifeline. You can do this once or you can do it twice, just to ensure it's secure. Then you can take this off of the machine. And we'll come back over to the table to show the finishing steps. So when we're ready, we can just take all of the weights and pegs and ravel cords off of everything, so that all we have left is the petal piece and the centre stamen. Now the centre stamen, I've pulled the cast off tail tight. It's been looped around twice, so it should be fairly secure. And I'm now going to push the needle back down through the centre of the cord. And we don't want to pull that too tight, because we don't want to scrunch up the cord. You can decide whether or not you want to use both tails to sew in, or whether you just want to use the cast on tail, in which case cut the cast off tail. Now, before we do any sewing for this petal piece, we want to steam it to get rid of all this curl. So I'm going to take some pins and just pin this out to an ironing board. I've got the iron preheating at the moment. And to ensure that the petal rounds out nicely, we're just going to come in and try and get rid of this point on the edges. Just to try and shape it a little bit more before we steam it, because once it's steamed, that will be the shape that it takes. So we're just going to come in, make sure your iron is on a steam setting, hover the iron over the work, fairly close but not touching the yarn, and we're just going to steam the piece lightly. You'll let it cool, and then you can take all of the pins out. And now we're ready to do some sewing. Now, for the sewing, what I've found easiest to do is to attach the stamen first. So you can take the tail, or tails if you didn't cut the other one off, and with the petal I'm going to fold that in half and I'm going to go in to that center point of the fold to secure the stamen through the work. Obviously that's only been pulled through the work, so it's not properly secured just yet. So we're going to come back and secure this a little bit better. So from the back we're going to come just to the side of where we were, and we're going to catch a little bit of the stamen and go back down through the centre, come up on the opposite side. In this case I'm coming to the right, and I'm going to catch a few strands and I'm going to go back down through the centre of both the stamen and the petal for this final securing stitch. And then at the back I'm just going to darning in these ends. Again, every time just making sure not to over tighten so that we don't cause puckering on the petal piece. So with the ends darned in, we can now trim and come back to the petal. Or the tail at the tip. We're just going to weave this into the back of the work. Every time we zigzag through, we just stretch the petal to make sure that it's not going to pucker. And we can trim this tail off. And the final part now is back at the base of the petal. We want to sew the two flat sides together. So we're going to fold the flower in half and we're going to sew each side together. Now in my case I only did the 2 rows. The difference being the 6 rows you'll have quite a long tab area, whereas if you want to applique this onto a garment, say, you may not want that visible extended area. So I've sewn down the 2 rows. I'm just whip stitching these, and then we're left with this sort of opening tube. What I'm going to do is go down through the centre of where we've just whip stitched, and through the back of the petal, and again come from the back up to the top, and we're just going to catch where this seam joins, and we're going to make sure that that sits right into where our stamen has been fixed in. Check it to see that you're happy with it, and then just darn in this tail. But you may want to leave the tail on so that you can attach this to your work. If you do make any of these items and you want to tag me, I'm on Instagram as dunfermline.machine.knitting. I'd love to see what you add to these, whether that's placing them onto a wreath or a garment. Feel free to tag me in any of your makes that you use from my videos. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave a comment, and until the next time, you've been watching Buttonmouse the Wee Machine Knitter.